This is the Justice Fighter Podcast. With attorney Gerald Griggs. Where we have conversations on social justice, civil rights, and political news that affects us all. Let attorney Griggs put you on game. Only on the Justice Fighter Podcast, y'all.
What's going on, y'all? It's attorney Gerald Griggs here on the Justice Fighter Podcast on the Justice Media Network. And I just wanted to hop into the pod and kind of reflect that it's been 10 years since the killing of Trayvon Martin, which kind of sparked the new movement in social justice and civil rights and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so considering that it's been 10 years and there was a march and rally and commemoration of his birthday and the fact it's been 10 years, I wanted to revisit where we've been. So this is the trailer for Rest in Power, the Trayvon Martin story. Let's listen to it and then we'll talk on the other side.
I need to file a missing person report with my son.
And what's his name?
Trayvon Martin.
Sanford Police Department.
Hey, there's a real suspicious guy. These always get away.
There's someone trying.
How many more kids will we wait for them to kill? My tears collecting like raindrops on a windowsill.
This kid was profiled, pursued, and shot in the heart.
George Zimmerman claimed self-defense, standing his ground.
It just polarized the country.
We were overcome with fear and anger.
Trayvon became the face of our community. We had to go to war for him.
Rest in power, rest in paradise. To all the babies too young to have had to pay the price.
You choose to grieve or to fight.
It took my son being shot down to make me stand up.
Rest in power, rest in paradise. You have become a symbol in the spirit life.
And that can be seen on Paramount. It's streaming now on the Paramount app. If you want to watch Trayvon Martin's story or under the hashtag Trayvon Martin story, rest in power. And so, you know, this weekend, many activists and the family and so many that supported this movement were down in Sanford, Florida, reflecting on the life of Trayvon Martin. He would be 27 years old if he was still here. But how that death galvanized the whole new generation, similar to the way the Emmett Till lynching happened in Mississippi that galvanized the civil rights movement. And so I wanted to kind of reflect on how far we've come, because there was a lot of articles and a lot of commentary on social media about how far we've come. And we have to remember that in 2012, it was a different time. We had elected a first African-American president, and he had served a term, and it was up to serve another term. And he actually came out and made certain statements. But since then, you know, we've had a lot of cases. We've gone from not being able to indict police officers or vigilantes to indicting them and convicting them. And we've come a long way, but we still have such a long way to go. You know, if you look at the trajectory of this movement from Trayvon to Ahmaud, we've seen activists and attorneys and celebrities all get involved and lend their voice in solidarity and strength to push the movement forward. And so we have to make sure we ground and center ourselves in fact and in history. We've seen a lot of progress. We've seen some attempts to push us backward, and we've seen the resolve of this movement that is now 10 years old to continue to push forward. We saw Ferguson, we saw Baltimore, we saw Minneapolis, we saw Louisville, we saw Atlanta. We've seen so many cities join in this movement for justice and liberation, and we've had our ups and our downs, but we always have to remember how far we've come. And so, you know, even the president of the United States, the 44th president of the United States, gave commentary on the effect of the Trayvon Martin case. And here's some sound from President Obama on this subject.
We're properly instructed that in a case such as this, reasonable doubt was relevant, and they rendered a verdict. And once the jury's spoken, that's how our system works. But I did want to just talk a little bit about context and how people have responded to it and how people are feeling. You know, when Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. And when you think about why, in the African American community at least, there's a lot of pain around what happened here, I think it's important to recognize that the African American community is looking at this issue through a set of experiences and a history that that doesn't go away. You know, there are very few African American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very, very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me, at least before I was a senator. There are very few African Americans who haven't had the experience of getting on an elevator and a woman clutching her purse nervously and holding her breath until she had a chance to get off. That happens often. And you know, I don't want to exaggerate this, but those sets of experiences inform how the African American community interprets what happened one night in Florida. And it's inescapable for people to bring those experiences to bear.
And so that was the President of the United States, the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama, giving remarks after the jury's verdict in the George Zimmerman trial, which was a trial for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And we all know that Mr. Zimmerman was acquitted of that crime, and so has gone on to do other work and have commentary. But we want to focus on Trayvon and the impact of this trial, the impact of the murder, the impact that galvanized so many to renew their vow for racial justice and civil rights and liberation in this country. We've seen the rise of so many new activists out of this movement. We've seen the rejuvenation of energy in some of the oldest civil rights organizations in the country. And we've seen the consistent resolve of a people to push past tragedy and pain and to purpose it with power. And I think that's the lesson of the Trayvon Martin case. Of course, that case, we saw in this country the rise of a new lawyer for Black America. That would be Benjamin Crump, and a legion of lawyers after him in that same vein. So, you know, when we reflect on what happened in Sanford, Florida, and how far we've come, we have to, you know, take a moment and really kind of reflect on where we're going and what the trajectory of this movement is. And so that's what I think about. I can remember the day I heard about the shooting. Of course, I was a practicing lawyer at the time and was really disheartened at what I heard happen to a young man who was walking home with a bag of Skittles and an iced tea, and that a neighborhood watch vigilante shot him in what he terms and what the jury determined was self-defense. But it reinvigorated the fire inside of me to continue my activism and to push forward. And of course, from that case to more of the national cases, Mike Brown and Walter Scott and Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, and then of course with Breonna and Ahmaud and George and Vincent and so many other cases, Rayshard Brooks, we've seen this constant beat of death, and we're starting to see accountability, like in Botham Jean and Anthony Hill, of course, and George George Floyd's case, and we're seeing it in Deontay Wright's case, and now the newest case, Amir Locke. We still have to continue to elevate our voices and push for justice, organize, mobilize, strategize, and not become disheartened, because we are seeing progression in our lifetime and a movement that is the biggest movement for social justice this country has ever seen. We cannot forget Freedom Summer 2020, and then, of course, the mobilization to vote in the 2020 election and the 2021 election. And that kind of drives me to the next topic I want to talk about as we reflect on activism and how activism can promote change. We saw the election of the new president, the 46th president of the United States, and the people rising up and voting in record numbers to send the 45th president, who came to rise in that same vein of I guess we would call it backlash and the striking out of white supremacy. We saw the rise of Donald Trump in the same vein as George Zimmerman felt empowered to kill an unarmed African American. But we saw President Biden arrive with certain promises, and that drives where we are now with the continued attempts to hold him accountable to those promises, which drives us to where we are with voting rights. And I wanted to talk about voting rights as we see more and more voting suppression tools being implemented in 19 states, and what we can do to push back on that. I think that we can still call for the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act with regard to police accountability, but also the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, because we all know that the purpose of activism is to raise awareness. The purpose of voting is to change laws that will change conduct, because Dr. King always said you can't legislate a man's heart, but you can sure constrain his actions through law. And I think that's where the next horizon really is in this movement. It's to continue to put pressure not only on the Congress, because we all know they failed to pass the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but we still have certain tools that we can use, namely the power of the Justice Department and the executive branch through the 1965 Voting Rights Act, with the still empowered Article 2 and Article 3, which gives them the ability to go after these states when they violate the rules pertaining to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which says that no one can be abridged or denied the right to vote based on their color, their race, or their past condition of servitude, which is the rights that were given to us by the Constitution and the amendments. And so, in reflecting on Trayvon Martin and how far we've come, we have to always remember that we are on a continuum of justice. We are on a continuum of liberation, and that we have come such a long way from 1865 to 2022. And even in 2012, we were able to see the combined power of organizing, the combined power of mobilizing, the combined power of the people to elevate and raise their voice in the demand for change and to achieve change. And so, in this episode, I want to talk about the next steps. I was so supremely proud to see the Trayvon Martin Foundation and the gala and all of the work that they've been doing, continuing to uplift his name and making sure that the call for justice continues out. But I can only think that that case helped so many other families be able to come to the forefront and find their voice, find their ability to demand change. And many of those families achieve accountability. We're still working on federal legislation, but in several states, hate crimes legislation has been passed. Arcane laws have been overturned, and we're still working on the Congress to make sure federal laws are passed. But when we have this conversation about nothing has changed, nothing has happened, that's just not factually accurate. But the reason why we focus so routinely on voting rights is that's the way you force the change. Voting rights is the ability to speak truth to power every 2 to 4 years and change those that make the laws, which the laws are the way that we create societal change. There's also another lesson in this case, which we've been saying over and over again. In order to get justice, you have to participate in the justice process, meaning you have to serve on juries. If you don't, if you forget that it was an all-white jury that acquitted George Zimmerman, and we have been in the process of educating individuals to serve on juries, and we saw in Brunswick, Georgia, what happens when you educate individuals on the importance of jury service. We saw in Decatur, in the Anthony Hill case, what happens when you educate jurors on the fundamental process upon which you get justice. You actually see justice in your time. And we also saw that in the George Floyd case, and we're continuing to see it in the George Floyd case as the federal trial is going on. So we cannot lose track of what's happening in real time and the results of what is happening in real time. So the marching orders now, as we move forward on the Justice Fighter podcast, is to continue to put pressure on the executive branch, the President of the United States, to do more, to make sure that we have executive orders in place that can address this conduct as we continue to lobby for legislative change. We cannot forget that we've had a modern civics lesson over the last 10 years, but particularly over the last 4 years, of how government actually works, and that we hold individuals accountable to their campaign promises on the local, state, and federal level, and then we will see that change. The reason why the change is so slow in happening is we still have relics of the past that are ingrained in the legislative process that use rules that are meant to suppress the voice of the majority in favor of minority rule. Examples of that would be the filibuster rule, the 60-vote majority that you need in the Senate to pass any piece of legislation. It's not a coincidence that many of these progressive bills that we want to see passed are being held up because of the filibuster. So it's time to carve out an exception. Now, we understand that Manchin and Sinema and several other senators are opposed to that, and that's why it's important that both in March and in April we will be having several major actions, one in Selma and one in West Virginia, where we will speak directly to those individuals and their constituents to make sure they understand the power of the constituency to push policy and change. That's what is missing currently, that we have to make sure that we continue to push that conversation as we move this movement forward. And that's why we need your assistance. If you're interested in continuing this conversation, we have to organize. So you need to join an organization, NAACP, the SCLC, Rainbow Push, some of the newer grassroots organizers and organizations like Black Voters Matter or the New Georgia Project or Fair Fight Action or others that may be national or international in scope to continue this push, because nothing happens by itself. There are activists that are pushing all of these conversations forward and making sure that rights are protected. So when we see things like the atrocity that happened with Trayvon or the atrocity that happened with Mike Brown, you see organizing happening in real time and a pushback that we continue to move forward and successfully learn from each case and calculate how we approach it and ultimately become successful. And so that's why it's important that we reflect. And so in this final analysis of the Trayvon Martin case, it continues to show us the power and resolve of families. In the spirit of Mamie Till Mobley, you see Sabrina Fulton, and you see Trayvon's father. And then you see that continuum of continuing the fight. And, you know, it was interesting to hear them speak and talk about in the 10-year anniversary where we go from here. And I think that it's quite clear where we go from here. We continue to push, we continue to fight, and we listen to those who have picked up the mantle and continue to strive for freedom, justice, and equality, and to end these atrocities that continue to happen. And so I want to leave us with the words of Sabrina Fulton as she reflected on the decade legacy of her son's death and where we go from here. And so here are the words of Sabrina Fulton.
Trayvon Martin could have been any one of our children. It could have been anybody's child. As I look at Trayvon's picture sometimes, he represents so much more. He represents so many more young people. No, I struggle with it every day. You know, it's a part of my life. If you wrote a book about Sabrina Fulton, you can't leave out chapter 5, where my 17-year-old son was shot and killed. My son was unarmed. He was 17 years old. He wasn't committing any crime. Trayvon's only crime was the color of his skin. When I'm in the airport, I actually count how many people are walking around with hoodies on, and they don't look suspicious. So why did my son look suspicious? It's because of the color of his skin. It blames the victim. The victim is now the problem, and the victim is the cause of their own death. They want to justify why the person was shot and killed. I don't believe that people are going to remember who he is. They're going to remember who Trayvon Martin was. We never remember the person who did these terrible things. We always remember the person that was shot and killed. If I asked 100 people right now who shot and killed Dr. King, they would not know, but they remember Dr. King. I absolutely think that change is happening. It's just going a little slow. When I look at the case of George Floyd, and I look at the case of Ahmaud Arbery, and the people killed them were convicted, and that they are going to be going to jail for the rest of their lives. But we had to lose lives in order to get to that point. And that's the part that I feel like we take 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. Because why did we have to lose those lives in order for us to move the country forward? My purpose is to continue to bring awareness to senseless gun violence, to try to change laws, helping other mothers to cope with the loss of a child. I can't change the world, but I certainly can do my part to make a difference in this world.
And so that was Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon Martin's mother, in an interview with ABC News. It's important that we listen to the words of Sabrina Fulton and how we continue to uplift these families because this is continuing to happen. And what we can learn from Trayvon's case is, like she said, is there is a continuum where you think of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and some of the other cases where there is a movement for justice and we are achieving accountability. And so what we must do is to stay resolute, to make sure that Trayvon's legacy is that we were awakened to the continuing problem that is occurring in this country, and we hold the powerful accountable to accountability for these families. And so on the 10-year anniversary of the loss of life of Trayvon Martin, we're going to wear a hoodie. We're going to walk in peace. We're going to seek justice. But more importantly, we're going to hold people accountable and to make sure that his name lives on forever in the justice movement. So this is Attorney Gerald Griggs, the justice fighter, and I will see you on the next episode of Justice, the Justice Fighter podcast here on the Justice Media Network. I'll see you on the next pod.
This is the Justice Fighter Podcast. Justice Fighter Podcast. With Attorney Gerald Griggs. Attorney G. Where we have conversations on social justice, civil rights, and political news that affects us all. Let Attorney Griggs put you on game. Only on the Justice Fighter Podcast, y'all.